In the criminal underworld, violence and murder are at the crux of power wielded by organized crime. These criminal organizations have multiple members who are willing and able to commit murder whenever it is deemed necessary. However, there are some men who become so skilled at the job of murder that their crimes become legendary. These killers are calculating, prolific, efficient, and know how to send a message. These killers are organized crime's top hitmen. Number 17. Yves, Apache, Trudeau. Yves Trudeau was born on February 4, 1946, in Quebec, Canada. By most accounts, Trudeau lived in a household with an approving mother who he got along well with. However, Trudeau's early life was tainted by his father's abuse and military-level strictness. During the 40s and 50s, Quebec was one of the most conservative areas of Canada. His father likely emulated these conservative morals. However, during Trudeau's teenage years, the Quebec Liberals won control of the provincial government, which ushered in a culture of hedonism in the 1960s, with Quebec having a significantly higher rate of illegitimate births and drug use than English Canada. As part of the same backlash against the suffocating conformism of Quebec's formerly conservative ideals, outlaw motorcycle clubs became very popular in Quebec in the 1960s, with many French-Canadian young men seeing the outlaw biker culture as a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and machismo, and by 1968, La Belle Province had 350 outlaw biker clubs. It is likely that this, along with rebelling against his father's abuse, that caused the gravitation of a young Trudeau to the outlaw lifestyle. In the early 1960s, while still a teenager, he held a job at Canadian Industries Limited, where he learned how to work with explosives. This training would later come in handy. In his early 20s, Trudeau would become a fixture in the increasingly popular outlaw biker scene in Montreal. His career as an outlaw biker and criminal took off in 1968, when at 22, he joined East End Montreal's Popeye's Motorcycle Club. The Popeye Moto Club was founded by Michael Sky Langola and Roger Calvet. The year of the club's formation has been variously reported as either 1951 or 1965, with the latter seeming more likely. Inspired by the fictional character Popeye the Sailor Man, the Popeye's patch featured the character smoking his signature tobacco pipe while riding on a cruiser motorcycle. Headquartered at 4862 Drolet Street in Montreal, Quebec, the Popeyes were regarded to be the most violent outlaw biker club in Quebec, and were notorious for engaging in gratuitous and sadistic violence. The Popeyes had a strict policy towards other motorcycle clubs whose logos featured a red and white color scheme. On multiple occasions, they would strip the patches of clubs bearing red and white colors and subsequently burn them. At the time of Trudeau's recruitment, the Popeyes were known for doing the usual gangster stuff: drugs, prostitution, extortion, and theft. But even then, Trudeau was a little different than his fellow bikers. True crime author James Dubrow would state that he had this fascination early in life with bikers and military things such as weapons and bombs. He became especially good with explosives, improving on what he learned during his teenage years at Canadian Industries Limited. Trudeau honed these skills that would become his trademark later in life. During Trudeau's recruitment phase and early years with the club, the Popeyes would be embroiled in a turf war with one of their biggest rivals. From 1968 up until 1970, a short but violent turf war for control of the drug trade went on between the Popeyes and the Devil's Disciples Motorcycle Club. Things kicked off when a violent confrontation involving roughly 100 members of both the Popeyes and the Devil's Disciples occurred on June 1, 1968. The skirmish involved the use of chains and baseball bats and left 4 bikers seriously wounded. On June 17, 1968, a knife fight broke out between both gangs after a group of 10 Popeyes blocked the road on Fabre Street in Jacques-Cartier, while 8 members of the Devil's Disciples were riding there. The engagement led to the death of 18-year-old Devil's Disciple member Jean-Yves Piquet, who later died of stab wounds. In May of 1969, Popeye Moto Club member Pierre Boucher was stabbed to death by 3 members of the Devil's Disciples, including Andre Burau. An autopsy report yielded that Boucher sustained a total of 58 knife wounds due to the stabbing. Trudeau would dispatch his first known victim, Jean-Marie Viel, in 1970. Viel was shot to death in Trois-Rivières after he stole a motorcycle from the Popeyes. In their fight with the Popeyes, the Devil's Disciples would ally with another outlaw biker gang called Satan's Choice. In 1974, Cecil Kirby and Garnett Mother McEwen of Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club in St. Catharines traveled to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to meet with senior members of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club, the second largest biker group in the United States. McEwen became especially close to the Outlaws and was the most vocal advocate within Satan's Choice of closer ties with the American club. Satan's Choice leader, Bernie Guindon, ultimately forged an alliance with the Outlaws in June of 1975. Under the terms of the agreement, the Outlaws were the exclusive distributors in the United States of the PCP and methamphetamine manufactured by Satan's Choice members in Northern Ontario. The Canadian Blue methamphetamine produced in Northern Ontario could be sold for $8,000 per pound in Canada, but in the United States could be sold for $12,000 per pound, a significant increase. As manufacturing methamphetamine produces a very unpleasant smell and can be dangerous, Northern Ontario, with its sparse population, numerous lakes, and vast forests, was ideal for manufacturing methamphetamine. The Outlaws, who controlled the markets in the Midwest, came to be dependent upon methamphetamine manufactured by Satan's Choice, making them a firm ally. Satan's Choice also gained access to a larger support network of clubs throughout the United States and beyond, opening the club to new business opportunities and possibly even reinforcements in the event of another club war. Meanwhile, the Outlaws gained a strong ally in Ontario, precluding any expansion by the Hells Angels into that region. Furthermore, the Outlaws gained a way to challenge the supremacy of the Hells Angels in Quebec through access to the Montreal chapter of Satan's Choice. This expansion led the Hells Angels-backed Popeyes into open conflict with the Satan's Choice Montreal chapter and their outlaw allies. The Popeyes had previously targeted the Devil's Disciple biker gang, who were allies of Satan's Choice. The Devil's Disciples and the Montreal chapter of Satan's Choice were engaged in the manufacture and smuggling of methamphetamine and PCP, a market that the Popeyes decided to violently enter in 1974, leading to a biker war. Trudeau would first rise to prominence as the Popeyes' main hitman during this struggle, killing several of the Devil's Disciples. These rival biker gangs had other allies as well. The Irish-Canadian West End gang would enter on the side of Satan's Choice, while the Dubois Brothers gang backed the Popeyes. The Popeyes were regarded to be the most violent outlaw biker club in Quebec and were notorious for engaging in gratuitous and sadistic violence, which is part of the reason why they were later chosen by the Hells Angels for recruitment. By January 1976, the Devil's Disciple gang had voted to disband after 15 members had been murdered. This gave the Popeye Club control of the area around St. Henry Square. In 1976, the leader of Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club, Bernie Guindon, was sent to prison for narcotics charges. In 1977, the Outlaws expanded into Canada, and the arrest of Guindon led to the fracturing of Satan's Choice. Garnett McEwen called a secret meeting on the 1st of July, 1977, with most of the chapter presidents being present when he called for patching over to the Outlaws. He argued that being members of an American-based club would add to their power, saying that the St. Catharines and Windsor chapters had already decided to join the Outlaws. The chapter presidents, known to be loyal to Guindon, were not invited to the meeting. At the close of the meeting, the Ottawa, St. Catharines, Windsor, and Montreal chapters officially left Satan's Choice in favor of the Outlaws. Meanwhile, after a lengthy scouting phase, the Popeyes were patched over by the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in 1977 to form the Hells Angels Montreal chapter, establishing the very first Hells Angels chapter in Canada. However, Only a fraction of the Popeyes members were considered worthy of wearing the Hells Angels cut and gang colors. A total of 35 members are believed to have patched over, the rest being either not interested or not up to the standard that the Hells Angels required. One of the new HAs was Yves Trudeau. Standing 5'6", weighing 135 pounds, and clean-shaven with short hair, Trudeau did not resemble the prototypical biker, but he had a growing reputation that other men respected and feared. Meanwhile, in Ontario and Quebec, tensions between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws began almost immediately, with small scuffles and incidents occurring towards the end of 1977. In February 1978, the Montreal Rockers became the second Quebec chapter of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. On the night of February 17, 1978, an incident occurred at a bar popular with the Hells Angels, the Brazier Joey, when two outlaws chose to drink until they were ejected by the local Angels. When the two outlaws stood outside cursing the Angels, a green car came down the street out of the snowfall and briefly stopped while the driver opened fire. Trudeau was the driver and the shooter who killed Robert Cote and wounded the other outlaw. The incident sparked a biker war between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws that was to last until 1984. The war would escalate quickly when on March 21, 1978, Trudeau would assassinate the Outlaws Motorcycle Montreal chapter president, Gilles Cadoret, with a bomb placed under his car. Cadoret was killed instantly and several others were injured by debris from the explosion. On the 25th of April, 1978, Dennis Lecure Kennedy and another Hells Angel entered the Outlaw Clubhouse at 144 Rue Saint-Ferdinand and went on a shooting rampage. Although no one was killed, a number of outlaws were wounded. On April 26th of that same year, Athanasa Tom Thumb Markopoulos, a member of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, was murdered by two members of the Hells Angels. On April 27, 1978, Kennedy shot and badly wounded an outlaw by the name of Francois Polacino and his girlfriend Suzanne Harvey while the two were drinking at the Industrial Brasserie Bar. Witnesses described the gunman who shot Polacino and Harvey as leaving in a green car, which the police found parked outside of the Angels clubhouse. Ballistics tests showed that the bullets fired in the Industrial Brasserie shooting were from the same handgun used in the attack at the Outlaws clubhouse. As a result, Hells Angels Canadian National President Yves Buteau changed the rules, ordering that henceforth Angels were to leave their guns at the scene of the crime in order to reduce the chances of police being able to tie crimes together. On May 12, 1978, the Outlaws struck back when a Hells Angel by the name of René Hebert was wounded, his arm being grazed in a drive-by shooting outside the Angels Montreal clubhouse. On May 26, 1978, Jean Gontier, an associate of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, was beaten to death by Paul Ringuet, an associate of the Hells Angels. At the time of the murder, they were both incarcerated at the penitentiary of St. Vincent de Paul in Laval. In October of 1978, Walter Stadnick, then the president of the Wild Ones Motorcycle Club in Hamilton, Ontario, traveled to Montreal to make contact with the Hells Angels national president, Yves Buteau. This meeting was to discuss having the Wild Ones patch over to become the first Hells Angels chapter in Ontario. The Outlaws saw the possibility of a Hells Angels chapter being established in Ontario by way of the Wild Ones as a threat. On October 12, 1978, two American outlaws, one from Miami and the other from Detroit, entered Le Tourbillon after following the Angels. One Angel, Louis Lapierre, rose to confront the two American outlaws, only to be gunned down when one of the outlaws pulled out his handgun, while the other outlaw pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and opened fire on the party in the booth. One of the Angels, Jean Bruchot, was killed while Lapierre and another Angel, Bruno Colombe, were badly wounded. The Wild Ones also suffered losses, with George Chico Massou and Gary Gator Davies being killed. Wild Ones Club president Walter Stadnick would survive by hiding under the table. Yves Buteau would go to work finding out the names of the outlaws that brought in the out-of-town assassins, while in the meantime, Yves Apache Trudeau would continue to take the fight to the outlaws by assassinating outlaw leader Brian Powers. Trudeau knocked on his door and shot him in the head 9 times when he answered. Trudeau would learn that the man who hired the 2 American outlaw assassins was Roland Roxy du Temple of the Outlaw Montreal chapter. Trudeau would send top Hells Angel assassin Yves Apache Trudeau to kill him. On the evening of December 8, 1978, Apache Trudeau saw a man walking down the street in Montreal who resembled outlaw leader Roxy du Temple. Trudeau walked up to him and asked him in French, "Are you Roxy?" When the man did not answer, Trudeau pulled out his handgun and shot him in the head. The next day, Trudeau learned from reading the newspapers that the man he killed was William Whitechold, who just happened to look like du Temple. Whitechold did not answer the question because he spoke no French and had no involvement with organized crime. Trudeau later remembered laughing hysterically when he learned from reading Les Devoirs that the man he killed was Whitechold and not du Temple. Trudeau's only disappointment with killing Whitechold was that the Angels chose not to pay him for that killing as he requested. He argued that people who looked like du Temple should be killed just in case they were du Temple. Trudeau would finally get another opportunity when on March 29, 1979, he destroyed the car of Roland du Temple, an outlaw informant, with explosives in Longueuil, Quebec. Du Temple died in the explosion. The war would continue to ratchet up with Yves Trudeau right in the middle of it. On April 3rd of the same year, Yves Trudeau killed Robert Lebel, a clothing importer, narcotics trafficker, and the former president of the Huns Motorcycle Club, who had patched over to the outlaws at his home in Fabreville, Quebec. On May 9, 1978, 3 members of the Hells Angels, Yves Le Boss Buteau, Jean-Pierre Mathau, and Yves Apache Trudeau, murdered Donald McLean, a member of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, as well as his girlfriend, Carmen Pichet. They were killed by an explosive that was attached to McLean's motorcycle. In September of 1979, Trudeau and other former Popeye members gained permission from the Montreal chapter to form the Montreal North chapter, which was based in Laval and was usually referred to as the Laval chapter. This new North chapter was mostly former Popeyes who still had their old Popeye attitudes. By the early 1980s, their notorious behavior, heavy cocaine use, flaunting of club rules, and the disrespect shown to other criminals was becoming a serious issue. This was in marked contrast to the Montreal South chapter, which was headed by Réjean Zig Zig Lessard, which consisted of men who joined the Angels after 1977 and were generally more disciplined in their behavior. The new Laval chapter's notorious behavior would cause many problems in the years to come, both for themselves and for their enemies. By now, Yves Apache Trudeau, also known as the Mad Bumper, had developed a reputation as one of the most feared men in Montreal. He would continue to live up to that reputation when in February of 1980, Trudeau would murder Jeanne Desjardins, who was the mother of ex-Hells Angels and suspected informant Andre Desjardins. Trudeau beat her to death for trying to help hide her son. Trudeau would then find and kill Andre Desjardins and his girlfriend Berthe later that same month. The bodies of Andre and Berthe were dumped in the St. Lawrence River. Media attention on the biker wars during the year of 1980 was relatively low in comparison to previous years. However, several brawls and attacks using Molotov cocktails and explosives had occurred throughout the year, costing both clubs significant losses in property and income. By late 1980, it was estimated by authorities that the Angels Outlaw Biker War had been responsible for 20 to 30 murders in Quebec and Ontario. The war trudged on, and Yves Apache Trudeau was the Hells Angels' most dangerous weapon. On March 14, 1981, Trudeau placed a bomb in the vehicle of an associate of the Outlaws, Robert Morin. The explosion ripped Morin to shreds, killing him instantly. 2 months later, on May 9, 1981, Trudeau would kill again, murdering Donnette Lemieux and his girlfriend Lucie Vallée on their porch in Rosemont. By the early 80s, Trudeau's reputation was so widespread that he began taking contracts from outside the Angels. Montreal's criminal community knew Trudeau's rep as a killer, says author Pierre de Champlain. He was very professional, very meticulous, and that's why they used his services. Trudeau committed several murders at the behest of the West End Gang, which was the largely Irish community of criminals operating out of Montreal's predominantly English-speaking Southwest. One of the contracts Trudeau fulfilled was the murder of Patrick Huey McGurnigan on October 27, 1981. Patrick Huey McGurnigan was a reputed West End gang member who was blown up in Westmont when a bomb planted in his Mercedes-Benz detonated, killing him and seriously injuring a male passenger. Frank Dunny Ryan, the gang's leader, ordered the hit. The West End Gang controlled the Port of Montreal, allowing them to import huge quantities of drugs fairly easily. Based on drugs and murder, the Hells Angels and the West End Gang would begin to develop a strong relationship. The ties between the two groups became so strong that in January of 1982, Ryan forced the Hells Angels to murder 3 of their own members and one of their girlfriends. The trio, led by founding Montreal Hells Angel and former Popeyes member Dennis Kennedy, had come up with a plot to kidnap one of Ryan's children and use the ransom money to pay back the coke money that they owed Ryan. Ryan found out and told the Hells Angels that they either kill the idiots behind the plot or lose access to the drugs he was importing. The first to go would be a member of the North Chapter named Charlie Hatches. Hatches was lured to a meeting and killed by Trudeau. His body was dumped in the St. Lawrence River. Trudeau would also be responsible for taking out the ringleader, Dennis Lecure Kennedy. Kennedy, who happened to be one of Trudeau's closest friends, was gunned down by Trudeau after being invited to go out for some drinks at a local bar. Crime journalist James Dubrow commented about his murder. That's the thing about biker gangs like the Hells Angels. They talk about a brotherhood, but when they find someone is no longer useful, they just get rid of him. Trudeau would continue his murderous rampage in 1983, killing André Forget, Ronald Bernard, Raymond Filion, and the brother-in-law of reputed mob boss Frank Cotroni, Michel Desormier, all within the span of a few months. The Desormier hit was cleared with the Montreal Mafia prior to the killing. Also that year, Canadian Hells Angels president Yves Le Boss Buteau was shot and killed. The shooter was 22-year-old drug dealer and outlaw prospect Gino Gaudreau. After the shooting, Gaudreau went into hiding but was arrested a few months later. He was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder but was acquitted after he had claimed self-defense because of earlier events. Buteau's murder did not change the fortunes of the outlaws, however. In March 1984, Bernard Savoy, the brother and right-hand man of Outlaw Montreal Chapter President Daniel Savoy, was killed when a bomb was planted in his car. In May of 1984, Daniel Savoy and another outlaw were assassinated on a highway by gunmen riding motorcycles. By 1984, the Hells Angels had virtually exterminated the Montreal chapter of the Outlaws. Trudeau had killed 18 out of the 23 outlaws slain during the conflict. Trudeau would kill again, this time hired by West End Gang associate Paul April to kill a local drug dealer named Philippe Galepieu. Trudeau would shoot Galepieu and his girlfriend Rachel Franquet in their Rue Cartier home. This would not be the last time Trudeau and Paul April would cross paths. On November 13, 1984, Frank Dunny Ryan was at the Jardine Motel on St. Jacques Street West in Montreal when Paul April, a French-Canadian associate, told him there was an attractive young woman waiting to have sex with him in the adjoining room. April and his associates, Robert Levere and Eddie Phillips, planned to tie Ryan to a chair and force him to reveal where he had hidden his fortune before killing him. Ryan resisted and threw a chair at Levere, who opened fire with his shotgun. As Ryan lay dying on the floor, someone finished him off by shooting him in the head with a .45 caliber handgun. It is unclear who actually shot Ryan. One of Ryan's killers, Eddie Phillips, told his brother John Phillips that, "I shot a dead man," claiming he had shot Ryan after his death on the orders of April and Levere. Ryan's killers fled so quickly they did not take any valuables. The police found Ryan's wallet with $6,000 cash, along with a gold chain still around his neck and a Rolex still on his wrist. When Frank Ryan was murdered, Trudeau was hired by the new leader of the West End gang, Alan the Weasel Ross, to exact revenge. A television stuffed with explosives was delivered to the apartment where Paul April and the rest of Ryan's killers were holed up. Michael Blass, a friend of Trudeau, arrived at April's apartment with the gift of a TV, a VCR, and the videotape Hell's Angels Forever. After Blass left the building, Trudeau used a remote control to detonate the bomb he had planted inside the TV. The explosion killed April, Robert Levere, Louis Charles Paquette, and Gilles Paquette. It also injured 8 others and knocked a huge hole in their apartment building in downtown Montreal. Alan the Weasel Ross had offered to pay Trudeau $200,000 to eliminate Ryan's killers, and he had already been paid $25,000 in advance. When Trudeau tried to collect the rest of the $200,000 after killing April and Levere, Ross told him he should go collect the money from the Halifax and Sorel chapters of the Hells Angels, who owed the West End gang drug debts, saying he would forgive those debts if those chapters paid the money to Trudeau instead. The president of the Hells Angels Halifax chapter, David Wolfe Carroll, paid Trudeau $98,000. Carroll later learned that the Laval chapter was actually entitled to 1/4 of the money and that Trudeau had used the extra money to support his cocaine addiction. Trudeau's thievery only added to the resentment many Hells Angels already felt towards members of the North chapter. Other Hells Angels felt that the North chapter bikers were too wild and uncontrollable. They often used the drugs they were supposed to sell and were suspected of cheating other chapters out of drug profits. A decision was made by Montreal South Chapter President Ray-Jean Zig-Zig Lessard and Halifax Chapter President David Wolfe Carroll to liquidate the North Chapter in what would become known in biker history as the Lennoxville Massacre. A meeting was set up in the Sherbrooke Chapter Clubhouse in Lennoxville on the 24th of March, 1985. At that gathering, 5 members of the North Chapter were shot to death, wrapped in sleeping bags, and dumped in the St. Lawrence River. The others were allowed to live and were absorbed into the Montreal South Chapter. Trudeau was supposed to be at this meeting. However, he sensed something was brewing between Sorel and Laval and that it would end in blood. So a week before the meeting, he quietly booked himself into a detox center just west of Montreal. That decision saved his life. Still in detox, Trudeau was offered a deal by the Hells Angels. Kill the 2 bikers who weren't at Lennoxville, as well as one of the dead biker's girlfriends, and he'd get some money back as well as his life. Trudeau, without a whole lot of options, agreed. He would be expelled from the motorcycle club, and he could no longer call himself a Hells Angel. He would also have to surrender his motorcycle and have his tattoos removed. Trudeau successfully murdered one of the targets, but could not get the other 2. In the meantime, the cops knew something was going on. They'd find out by June when the bodies started floating to the surface of the St. Lawrence River. During that time, close to a dozen bodies were hauled from the river or found in the surrounding area. Over the spring and summer of 1985, cops would haul in a number of bikers and carry out a number of raids aimed at fatally disrupting the Hells Angels in the province. But it would take more than what they had to effectively decapitate the club's leadership. They needed someone who knew the gang from the inside out, who knew its dirty secrets, and who didn't have anything to lose. They needed someone like Yves Trudeau, and fortunately for them, they had him. Trudeau must have known his days were numbered. There was a $50,000 bounty on his head, and he'd made a lot of enemies. But then, salvation came in the most unexpected way. He was picked up on a weapons charge in April of 1985 and sentenced to a year in prison. A couple of months later, while incarcerated, Trudeau cut a deal. He would testify against his former colleagues in exchange for a cushy cell and a reduced sentence. He publicly delivered his first bombshell testimony at a coroner's inquest that August. In 1985, Trudeau pled guilty to 43 counts of manslaughter, meaning that as far as the Crown is concerned, Trudeau did not intentionally kill his 43 victims, 29 of whom died from firearms, 10 from bombs, and 3 from being beaten to death. One was also killed via strangulation. Police estimate that 30 to 35 of his victims were other motorcycle gang members or sympathizers. Trudeau also testified on 40 other murders and 15 attempted murders. As part of his controversial contract with the government, Trudeau was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 7 years. Under his deal, the government also gave him $40,000 over the next 4 years and about $35 a week for cigarettes. Trudeau was granted parole in 1994 and given a new identity. He lived under the name Dennis Cote and resettled in the Valleyfield area, lived with a woman who did not know his past, and worked as an orderly in a nursing home and driving a bus for the handicapped. However, after being laid off in 2000, he slid back into cocaine addiction and sexually assaulted a 13-year-old boy after plying him with wine and beer, for which he pled guilty in 2004. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison by Quebec court judge Michael Duceppe, who noted, "In your lifetime, you have killed more people than the Canadian military did in the Gulf War." Trudeau returned to prison under the double stigma of being both an informant and a child molester, meaning that he had to be kept in isolation 23 hours a day. In 2006, Trudeau was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. Then in July 2008, the Canadian National Parole Board granted him parole and ordered him released to an outside medical care facility. As part of his release, Trudeau was not allowed to contact minors or the victims of his crimes. The sister of one of Trudeau's victims opposed him being granted parole and told the Journal de Montreal, "Killing to him was like buying a bag of milk. A guy like that doesn't have a soul. That cancer is justice." Yves Trudeau was one of Canada's most notorious killers. While he was a hitman for the Hells Angels and the mob, he used several different methods to get the job done. He had no conscience or empathy for his victims. Yves Apache Trudeau was truly a monster. He was also one of organized crime's top hitmen.